You sit down to rest and something won't let you. The body is still, but the mind keeps working, running a quiet ledger of everything you should be doing instead. You feel the pull to get up, to be productive, to justify your existence with activity. And on the rare occasions you manage to actually stop, to lie down in the middle of the afternoon, to do nothing at all, to let an hour pass without producing anything, a strange discomfort creeps in. Guilt, as though rest were a small theft, as though you were getting away with something, as though a person who is not working is a person who is failing at the fundamental task of being a person. You've probably assumed this feeling is just conscience, the healthy voice of a responsible adult who knows they should be doing more. But what if it isn't yours at all? What if the guilt you feel every time you rest was placed in you deliberately, taught to you so early and so thoroughly that you've mistaken it for your own nature? What if the belief that you must always be working, that your worth is measured by your productivity, that rest must be earned, and idleness is a sin? What if all of that is not wisdom, but conditioning, installed in you because it serves the interests of people who benefit from your endless labor? This is exactly what the philosopher Bertrand Russell argued, with devastating clarity, nearly a century ago. In a famous essay, he took aim at what he called the cult of work, the near-religious belief that work is virtuous and idleness is shameful. And he made a case that should unsettle anyone who has ever felt guilty for resting. That the guilt is not a sign of your virtue. It is a sign of how completely you have absorbed a morality designed to keep you working, a morality that has never actually served you at all. Bertrand Russell was one of the towering intellects of the 20th century, a British philosopher, mathematician, logician, and social critic, whose work spanned an extraordinary range. He helped reshape the foundations of mathematics and logic, wrote on everything from epistemology to ethics to politics, and won the Nobel Prize in Literature. He was, by any measure, a serious thinker, not given to lazy provocations, which makes it all the more striking that he devoted one of his most famous essays to a defense of idleness. That essay, published in 1932, was titled In Praise of Idleness, and in it Russell mounted a direct assault on one of the most deeply held and least examined beliefs of modern society, the belief that work is inherently virtuous and that idleness is a moral failing. He argued that this belief, which most people simply take for granted as obviously true, is in fact a harmful piece of conditioning, historically constructed and deliberately maintained, that has caused an immense amount of unnecessary human suffering. Russell's argument was not that work is bad or that nothing should ever be done. He was not lazy, and his own life was one of prodigious output. His argument was subtler and more radical than that. He claimed that we have been taught to overvalue work far beyond its actual usefulness, to treat it as an end in itself rather than a means to a good life, and to feel moral shame at rest and leisure that are not only harmless but essential to a fully human existence. And he traced this belief to its roots, showing that it did not arise from wisdom about how to live well, but from the interests of those who have always benefited from other people's work. He wrote that the morality of work is the morality of slaves, and that the modern world has no need of slavery. What he meant was that the belief in the sacredness of work was developed, historically, to serve the powerful, to convince those who labor that their labor is virtuous so that they would continue to do it without complaint, and to make them feel guilty at any rest that might interrupt their usefulness to others. The guilt you feel when you rest, in Russell's analysis, is the internalized voice of this ancient arrangement, a voice that speaks in the language of virtue but serves the logic of exploitation. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. To understand why you feel guilty when you rest, Russell would have you look at history, because the guilt did not arise naturally, and it was not always there. It was manufactured over centuries out of a combination of necessity and power. For most of human history, Russell pointed out, the total amount of goods a society could produce was limited, and producing enough to survive required most people to work very hard. In such a world, there was a genuine practical logic to valuing work. A society that did not work enough would starve. But there was also, layered on top of that necessity, something less innocent. A small class of people, the powerful, the owners, the rulers, lived in leisure precisely because everyone else worked. And this arrangement required justification. It required that the people doing the work believe that their work was noble, that duty demanded it, that there was virtue in labor and shame in its absence. Because a laboring population that believed in the sacredness of work was far easier to govern than one that asked why they should toil while others rested. So the gospel of work was preached, and Russell chose that religious word deliberately. The belief in the moral value of work took on a quasi-religious character, reinforced by centuries of teaching that idle hands were the devil's workshop, that work was a duty owed to God and society, that a person's worth was proven through their industry. This teaching served the interests of the powerful perfectly. It kept the workers working, and it kept them feeling virtuous while they did it, and guilty whenever they stopped. The guilt was not a byproduct. In a sense, the guilt was the point, the internal enforcement mechanism that made external coercion less necessary. Russell was especially critical of the way this belief outlived the conditions that once made hard labor necessary. By the 20th century, he argued, modern technology and industrial productivity had advanced to the point where the total work required to provide everyone with a decent life had dramatically decreased. In principle, the machines that human ingenuity had produced could have been used to give everyone more leisure. Shorter working hours, more time for rest, education, art, and enjoyment. Russell famously suggested that a 4-hour working day would be entirely sufficient to produce the necessities and comforts of life for everyone, if work were organized sensibly and distributed fairly. But this did not happen. Instead of using increased productivity to reduce work and expand leisure, society kept people working long hours anyway, some working themselves to exhaustion while others had no work at all. And the reason, Russell argued, was precisely the persistence of the old belief. The cult of work had become so deeply embedded that people could no longer imagine that rest and leisure might be good, or that a life with less work might be a better life. The guilt had outlived its original function and become a kind of permanent, self-perpetuating prison, one in which people continued to feel that they must work constantly and that rest was shameful long after the practical necessity for such relentless labor had passed. There is a particular cruelty in this that Russell understood well. The guilt does not distinguish between necessary work and unnecessary work, between labor that genuinely needs doing and labor performed merely to satisfy the belief that one must always be busy. It attaches itself to rest as such, to any moment of stillness, any hour of leisure, regardless of whether the work it interrupts actually matters. A person in the grip of the cult of work will feel guilty resting even when there is nothing urgent to do, even when the rest is exactly what their exhausted body and mind require, even when the work they rush back to is trivial or could easily wait. The guilt is not responding to a real demand. It is responding to a rule, the rule that says a person must always be producing, and that stillness is a kind of moral failure. And because the rule is internal, there is no escaping it by finishing the work. There is always more work that could be done, and so the guilt never releases its hold. The person who has fully absorbed the cult of work can never rest easy, because in their inner world, rest is never fully permitted. This is why the guilt feels so relentless and so inescapable. It is not tied to any particular unfinished task that could be completed to earn relief. It is tied to the very act of resting, which the conditioning has defined as suspect. And this means that no amount of productivity can ever satisfy it. The harder you work, the more the standard rises. The more you produce, the more you feel you should produce. Russell saw that this was a trap without an exit, so long as the underlying belief remained unquestioned, a treadmill on which the runner can never arrive because the destination was never real. Russell did not attack the cult of work merely because it caused unnecessary labor. He attacked it because he believed it was destroying something precious, the very things that make a human life worth living and that make civilization itself possible. And he made a historical argument that turns the usual moral picture completely upside down. The great achievements of human civilization, Russell observed, the art, the philosophy, the science, the literature, the discoveries that have enriched human existence, were very often produced by people who had leisure. Throughout history, the leisured classes, for all their faults, were the ones who had the time to think, to create, to pursue knowledge for its own sake, to develop the arts and sciences that constitute the highest expressions of the human spirit. Leisure, in other words, was not the enemy of human accomplishment. It was frequently its precondition. Without time free from the demands of labor, there is no space for the contemplation, experimentation, and creativity that produce everything we most value. This led Russell to a striking conclusion. A civilization that eliminates leisure in the name of work does not thereby become more productive of what actually matters. It becomes poorer, starved of the very conditions that produce beauty, knowledge, and joy. The relentless emphasis on work, on being constantly busy and productive, actually strangles the higher human capacities that only leisure can nourish. When everyone is too busy working to think, to create, to simply be, the culture as a whole grows narrower, more frantic, and less alive. The cult of work, meant to produce value, ends up destroying the deepest sources of it. And at the individual level, the cost was equally severe. Russell believed that a life consumed by work, with no room for genuine leisure, was a diminished life, one deprived of the rest, the play, the contemplation, and the free enjoyment that make existence rich rather than merely functional. The person who works constantly and feels guilty at every pause is not living more fully than the person who knows how to rest. They are living less fully, having sacrificed the enjoyment and the growth that leisure makes possible on the altar of a productivity that was never the actual purpose of a human life. Russell also understood something that modern research has since confirmed, that constant work without adequate rest does not even serve productivity well. Exhaustion, overwork, and the absence of rest degrade the quality of thought and work, breed irritability and cruelty, and diminish the very capacities that work requires. The frantic, guilt-driven busyness of the cult of work is not only joyless, it is often counterproductive, producing worse work than a rested, balanced life would produce. The guilt that drives you back to work every time you try to rest is not even making you better at your work. It is simply making you tired and depriving you of the leisure in which you might have actually lived. Russell's essay was a work of social criticism, not a self-help guide, but his analysis points clearly toward a way of freeing yourself from the guilt that shadows your rest. The liberation begins with understanding, and it deepens into practice. The first movement is to recognize the guilt as conditioning rather than conscience. This is the essential first step, and it follows directly from Russell's argument. The guilt you feel when you rest is not the voice of your true moral sense, telling you an important truth about how you ought to live. It is the internalized echo of a belief that was taught to you, a belief constructed, historically, to serve interests that were never your own. When you feel that familiar discomfort at resting, the practice is to name it accurately. This is not my conscience. This is the cult of work, speaking inside me. This reframe does not dissolve the guilt instantly, but it strips it of its authority. A guilt you recognize as installed conditioning has far less power over you than a guilt you mistake for moral truth. The second movement is to reclaim leisure as valuable in itself, not as something that must be earned. The cult of work permits rest only as a reward. You may rest once you have worked enough to deserve it, and even then only briefly, before returning to your labor. Russell's argument overturns this entirely. Leisure is not the reward for a life of work. It is one of the central goods of life itself, the condition for thought, creativity, joy, and genuine human flourishing. The practice here is to allow yourself rest and leisure, not because you have earned them, but because they are good. Because a life with room for them is a better life than one without. You do not need to justify rest by pointing to how hard you worked to deserve it. Rest is its own justification. The third movement is to question the equation of your worth with your productivity. Beneath the guilt lies a deeper belief that your value as a person is a function of what you produce, and that to rest is to become, temporarily, worthless. Russell's analysis reveals this equation as part of the same manufactured morality. Your worth is not measured by your output. You are not a machine whose value lies in its production. The practice is to catch yourself in the moment when resting makes you feel worthless, and to recognize that this feeling rests on a premise you never actually chose to believe, a premise that serves the logic of endless work, not the truth of human dignity. You have worth when you are producing nothing at all. A person is not a factory. The fourth movement is to actually practice rest deliberately, in defiance of the guilt, until the guilt loosens. Understanding alone will not fully free you, because the guilt is a habit as much as a belief, worn into you over a lifetime. It weakens only through repeated experience of resting and discovering that the catastrophe the guilt predicts does not come. So the practice is to rest on purpose, to take the afternoon, to do nothing, to enjoy leisure, without immediately converting it into another form of productivity, and to sit with the guilt when it arises without obeying it. Each time you rest despite the guilt and find that you are not thereby ruined, not thereby worthless, not thereby a failure, the old conditioning loses a little of its grip. You are teaching yourself, through direct experience, what Russell argued through history and logic, that rest is not a sin, and that a life with room for it is not a lesser life, but a fuller one. Bertrand Russell looked at the guilt that modern people feel when they rest and saw something most of us never question, that it is not natural, not inevitable, and not, in the end, in our interest. It is the residue of an ancient arrangement in which the many worked so that the few could rest, sustained by a morality that taught the workers to find virtue in their labor and shame in their leisure. That morality outlived the conditions that created it, and it lives on now inside you, speaking in the voice of conscience while serving the logic of a system that was never designed for your flourishing. To feel guilty every time you rest is to carry in your own body the weight of centuries of conditioning that told you your worth is your usefulness and your rest is a theft. Russell's gift was to show that this is a lie with a history, a lie with beneficiaries, a lie that has cost human beings an incalculable amount of joy, creativity, and life. He believed that a sensible civilization would use its enormous productive capacity to give everyone more rest, not less, and that the highest human achievements have always depended on leisure rather than being threatened by it. And he believed that the individual who learns to rest without guilt is not becoming lazy or worthless, but reclaiming something essential that the cult of work had stolen. You do not have to earn your right to exist through constant labor. You do not have to justify every hour with productivity. You do not have to feel that rest is a failure and busyness a virtue. These beliefs were placed in you, and they can be set down. The guilt you feel when you rest is not the truth about how you should live. It is the sound of an old master's voice, still giving orders long after the master is gone. And you are free, whenever you choose, to stop obeying it. Rest is not the thing you do when you have finished being worthwhile. Rest is part of what a worthwhile life is made of. The person lying in the afternoon sun, doing nothing, justifying nothing, producing nothing, is not failing at life. They may, in that moment, be living more truly than they ever do at their desk, recovering the leisure in which thought, joy, and meaning actually grow. Russell spent his life defending that possibility. The least you can do, the next time you rest, is to let yourself actually rest, and to recognize the guilt, when it comes, as the last complaint of a morality that was never really yours.